Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm very glad and honored to be here to talk to you about Arabic typography and calligraphy. Before we start, I'd like to know how many of you wrote Arabic as the language you'd like to learn how to read. Can you raise hand? I see some of you are already familiar with the language. Most of you are not. First of all, you may wonder what is this bird doing on the screen in the presentation of calligraphy. This is a design I did in response to the tragic events in my country of birth, Syria. This is a bird that's made of the word salam, peace, and hub, love, two things that are certainly missing in Syria now with all the killing and destruction of people and property and valuable heritage. I'm here because we have a theme of backwards, and in our case it's backwards writing. Most of you are familiar with Leonardo da Vinci, who did write his texts backwards. They can be read when reflected in a mirror, as you can see here on the right. He added, the text is quite nice, but he added many flourishes to add to the mystery and confusion of the text for those who want to read it. But for users of Arabic language, writing from right to left is indeed the norm. We read our text like this, and we open our books from the back of the book and move forward. If somebody told me I would be talking here today about calligraphy and typography when I was a young man, I wouldn't have believed him, because when I was young, I actually started my life as a painter. And I had no interest in typography, and especially in calligraphy, which I didn't consider as a modern day type of art. I was interested in learning and practicing more according to European standards. So I learned drawing, painting, and illustration, and for the first maybe 15 or 20 years of my life, I was always an artist who grew up in time to become more interested in how the art that I produce relate to other people, and that led me to focus more on graphic arts and applied arts. I wanted my work to be closely examined and used by people, and I spent some years doing book covers, posters, and things of that nature. Now, when you deal with that type of practical application, the issue of calligraphy or text becomes an important issue. And in those days, with my limited interest and experience, I still had to come up with writing that would fit my graphic designs, because in the 60s and 70s, we didn't have many choices in terms of Arabic script, and anything that had a special visual effect that I imagined, I had to create my own. So that led me gradually to become more interested in typography. Now, these works were done almost 40 years ago, and over this time, I continued to do that type of work, and I slowly made text more dominant in my work, as you can see here in a piece of poetry by Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. It talks about his rendezvous with words and light, even in the darkness of the night. As I grew older, my family convinced me that I should go to college to study architecture, because in Syria, as in most of the Middle East, art is not a valid or a life-sustaining business. So I did study architecture and practiced architecture for a number of years. When I designed this building, a small museum that's made up completely of lettering and words, I didn't know at the time that lettering and script will continue to become more important in my creative life. This is a museum for the unknown soldier. It was submitted to a national competition in Syria, but it did not win an award. I had another entry where I used doves and more realistic representation, which did receive an award. But this type of thinking where the word or the text itself becomes the art object was not appreciated yet at that time. This is again, this was designed in the mid-1970s, but since then, the art that's based on text, calligraphy, and contemporary interpretations became slowly more prominent in the Middle East and throughout the world as well. In the late 70s, I came to Seattle. I went to the University of Washington to continue my architectural studies. And for a few years, I worked as an architect here in town and had my firm. I did mostly I did mostly interior design projects. This is a small mosque I designed in Montlake Terrace. And there were a number of other projects in terms of interiors. One of the projects that may be familiar to some of you is the restaurant Saleh Al Lago, which was a popular restaurant for a number of years by Green Lake. But practicing architecture was not quite fulfilling to me because it did not give me enough of a chance to incorporate my own heritage and my interest in Arab and Islamic art and architecture to the point where it can fill my time. Doing architecture requires that I do mostly what my clients wanted me to do. So I slowly shifted my emphasis to graphic design, and that continued the process of learning about calligraphy and type. By this time, I had to consult books online and things like that because I no longer had access to the people who would have taught me calligraphy if I was still at home in Syria, in Aleppo. These are a few examples of the calligraphy that I incorporate into many of my projects. These two pieces were done for the Ramadan calendar, the fasting month. We produce a calendar every year for the Muslims in the area. It indicates when the sun rises, when the sun sets, so they know when to stop eating and when you can break their fast. Each year, we select a quotation from the Quran, and I prepare the calligraphic interpretation to go with the actual calendar. In practice, I started to design my own fonts, but also I continued to do work for other clients, especially when that work involves either the design of calligraphic pieces or the incorporation of my fonts so that I can see in practice how they would actually work. This is a cover of a report that was submitted to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for a proposed study to improve transportation in Mecca, where millions of Muslims come to pilgrimage every year. Here, the top line is one of my earlier font designs. This here is done in the classic thuluth style, which is a more traditional style. Another project for another proposal to the Saudi government incorporated a number of calligraphic designs that were animated into a presentation. I prepared about 8 different phrases, and these were built slowly to express something related to the text itself. This is another piece of the same presentation. This is a piece that morphs into a more architectural type of writing, which we call square Kufic. And this here is my sketch that was used to produce that piece. In this type of design, I start with the traditional writing of fitting the text into a geometric grid, and then I break it down into elements that I compose in 3-dimensional space and end up with calligraphic constructions that probably reflect somewhat my training as an architect. Square Kufic calligraphy is one of my favorite styles of Arabic calligraphy. I spent a number of years doing intensive study and wrote my PhD dissertation on the history of this style of calligraphy. Although it's very rigid, it is possible sometimes to introduce more fluidity to these types of designs. For a mosque, an interior of a mosque and community center in California, I produced this piece of calligraphy that is based on a traditional example from a mosque in Turkey from the 16th or 17th century. In the middle, I introduced another work that was done for the same project. This type of square kufi we have already seen, but the more complex design here is in thuluth calligraphy. It starts with the phrase Bismillah Rahman Rahim, in the name of God, the most merciful, the compassionate. Allahu Nuru Samawati wal Ard. God is the light of the heavens and the earth, and goes on and on. These type of designs are written in a line where parts of the text are also superimposed a little bit over in order to fill the complete space. It is challenging to have something that is readable, that is that maintains the classic proportions, and still end up with a harmonious and pleasing design. Now, Arabic is a script that evolved from Phoenician, and Phoenician is the same source through Greek and early Latin of your English alphabet. So from these early primitive designs, Arabic evolved in one way and Latin in another, but they both share the same source. Arabic is a cursive script, which means letters have to be always connected to each other in a word. This means that a letter can be either in the beginning of a word, in the middle, or in the final part of the word, and each part will have to have its special. Is the sound okay? It's okay. Each position requires some modifications to the letter to allow for its connection. These small arrows here indicate that this can connect on this side, this can connect on both sides, and also here we have the rest of the letters in their isolated form. This cursive quality makes the design of Arabic fonts more complex and more challenging than you would have in Latin, except when you are, of course, designing a cursive Latin where you face similar issues and challenges. The two general styles of Arabic calligraphy are either the Kufic, which is the more geometric, and the older group of styles, starting with the early Kufic and then evolving into a more elegant and contrasting Eastern Kufic. But around the 10th century, Kufic slowly started to die out, and its use was limited to headlines, to architectural monuments, and so on. In the 13th and 14th century, the square Kufic evolved as some kind of a reaction to the over-decorated and quite complex designs that evolved in the past several centuries. The other group we call cursive calligraphy, and one of the early popular styles is called muhaqqaq, but the most common and the most used is the naskh style. Naskh means writing, or the style of the scribe. It is an elegant, clear, and efficient to write. When you use your reed pen or similar tool, you can produce all these letters without a lot of effort and without a lot of retouching or overdrawing. This is not the case with the more royal and complex style of thuluth, where there is some drawing involved, but there are a lot of variations for the letter forms that would allow the calligrapher to vary the design to meet certain requirements. In Iran, Nastaliq evolved in the 14th century, and then in Turkey, Diwani and Ruqa evolved after the 15th and 16th centuries. The Arabic script itself looks quite complex when you look at some of these designs, but it's structured around basic skeletons for the letters. On these, we add dots to distinguish some sounds that have the same letters. And then the vowels are added as small marks rather than as full letters in the alphabet. In calligraphic practice, there are some smaller forms of letters that are written below these letters when the letter can be confused with another one, because we have, as I said, several letters where you have the basic same skeleton and they differ only with the addition of dots. So for those letters that do not have dots, a little representation of the letter below emphasizes that this is that specific sound. Finally, calligraphers introduced a number of marks like these here, here, and here, only for purposes of decoration and filling a space. This is Arabic typesetting, a typeface I designed for Microsoft. It is based on classic Nasr, and here we see a fully vocalized text of the first verse of the Quran. Vocalization, or the addition of the vowel marks, is not usually required in daily uses, but in the Quran it has to be added to make sure the pronunciation is quite correct. I said that letters in Arabic require different forms based on their position in a word. So on the top you see the different forms of one of these letters. When these are connected to each other, you get the shape that you see here, a continuous stream of letters. But some of the Arabic letters actually require connection from above rather from the baseline. Although this is an acceptable form, this is the more calligraphically correct form. In this design, we made an analysis of traditional manuals of teaching Nasr calligraphy and decided the different forms of each letter that would be required to connect to the other letters. So in addition to the 4 basic forms that we have seen for each letter, in some styles like this, you can have up to 5 or 10 different forms of each one of these components in order to connect properly to other letters. So here you can see the letter R. When it's connected to certain letters, it would have the same shape. But in this case, because we have a tooth before it, it has to become part of what in Latin you call a ligature, but in Arabic it's actually a component. When it comes after these 2 letters, it has to have a different shape and so on. The letter Kaf or K can be quite short and brief here, but depending on what comes after it, it has to extend or it has to contract again. An important aspect of Nasr calligraphy is what we call in Arabic teeth, these little extensions that represent many different sounds based on the number and position of the dots that come after it. In some words, there may be 3, 4, 5, 6 different teeth following each other, and if they are all consistently drawn or written, they would be very hard to read or distinguish. So there has been a system of variation of the height and shape of these teeth, which would actually create a visual indication immediately of how many teeth there are and aid in their reading and recognition. For this, we had to program the font to allow for replacing or using the proper form based on the context of each word. In traditional calligraphy, we also have a tradition of slanting the baseline for each word as you go. So these letters are not written exactly on the baseline. So in Arabic typesetting, we made these connections slightly higher as you go through, and achieved either a subtle incline, as you can see here, but sometimes quite a dramatic departure from the baseline. There are many other features in the font that imitate calligraphic tradition. For example, the word Allah, God, has its own certain shape. The ascenders, when they connect to certain letters, mostly ascenders following them, the connection drops below the baseline. You can see here this is a normal connection, but when you have another vertical line, you have this kind of a drop. Certain letters can take different shapes based on aesthetic preference. These are a few designs in the Naskh tradition, starting with Arabic typesetting on the top, and then more compact or more simplified designs below. Another group of typefaces is not actually based directly on tradition and the study of traditional rules. Rather, it's based on a visual concept. For example, here my font Shelia, which I started many years ago, but finally had it released recently by Linotype. In here, we have a visual goal of more harmonious and geometric and uniform shapes, as well as the creation of a large family of fonts that would give Arab graphic designers the tools that they could use in their trade. For Arabic, we have a severe lack of extended families where you would have more than just 2 weights. And here, in addition to the 6 or 7, actually 8 different weights, I also have the condensed and compressed versions. The font has a number of features that are based on the study of Kufi calligraphy, but it is thoroughly quite modern and takes advantage of my experience with Latin typography as well. Shelia has a number of ligature phrases. These are traditional phrases that are used after the name of the prophet or the name of God or so on. And here we have them for most of the commonly used phrases. In addition, there is an extensive array of stylistic sets where the user can control many aspects of how the text is going to look. And some of these are quite straightforward, but others like this one here require quite a bit of programming in order to allow for the overlap of text only when there are no parts of the second section that would interfere or would go down below. So for each one of these, we have to check what comes after, make sure there are no descenders, and then we can allow this feature to take place. And this type of work, by the way, is done by my daughter, who is the programmer in the company. Here, I show some of the features that are in a font that are designed to facilitate justification of text. In Arabic, we do not add space in order to make a line wider or narrower. We have to either extend a connection or introduce a swash, and these are the types of features that aid in a pleasant typesetting of text. The font has a number of ornament glyphs that can be put together to create a large number of borders, of bars, and things like that. And finally here, we see the Latin and the Arabic, a few weights, and this is, again, the main, one of the main features of this text that made it to one of the tallest, actually the tallest building in the world. This is Burj Khalifa in Dubai, where a custom version was used with Latin here. In these types of uses that are becoming more common, we see clearly that the two languages are written, although quite often backwards, but in many cases in a compatible and harmonious way. Thank you for listening. I'll be happy to take any questions as the time allows. Thank you. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you ever need anything regarding Arabic, script, calligraphy, typography. I have brought some postcards with my email address and website address outside. You are welcome to pick up one when you leave. Yes?
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the challenge of continuing the craft of calligraphy written by hand versus it being set on the computer, and how do you see that relationship evolving?
The question is about the challenges when dealing with typography that is based or related to a calligraphic tradition that's done basically by hand. These are two different realms of expression. And indeed, there are certain challenges. Anyone who dealt with converting a handwritten text to typographic text or typographic design handles. On one hand, calligraphy is still practiced by apprenticeship, where a student would go under a master's wing and for years practice until he or she masters the correct and exact proportions of the script. Now, Arabic calligraphy has a tradition of exactness and precise proportions. It's not like Chinese or Japanese where personal expression is allowed as much, or where you can have a lot of freedom in terms of how you write letters. In Arabic, for almost 1,000 years, the goal was always to reach the exact perfect shape that has been attained, and over time, only small evolutions took place, so that right now, I can read a 10th century text without any confusion or without any changes from what we would do today. In typography, you have a different set of challenges, because we don't aim only to produce the text in its perfect shape, but we have to produce it in a variety enough of expressions that would be useful for users. In other words, in Naskh calligraphy, there's only Naskh style. It cannot be lighter or bolder than the perfect shape. But in typography, if we have only one weight, that would not be enough for us to meet the many demands in print production and so on. In the past, calligraphers had to use different styles, for example, for the headlines, in order to distinguish them from text. But now we can actually expand on those traditional rules by introducing a variety of proportions and treatments that, in my own opinion, are enriching, but for some small minority is not considered the right approach, because it does not perfectly reproduce calligraphy. In many cases, there are people who lament the loss of calligraphic art, but I think we have to distinguish between the two trades, or the two arts, as fulfilling different needs. In calligraphy, you want to produce a perfect work that's aesthetically pleasing. That's the main goal. In typography, we have to be legible, we have to be efficient, expressive, and so on. And I don't see one actually replacing the other, but especially for Arabic, typography has to be inspired and guided by traditional calligraphy for sure. Yes?
The typography is very complex and subtle. Does that reflect the Arabic language? Is that a complex and language that has a lot of subtlety to it?
No, the typography doesn't really reflect the language, because Arabic is used for maybe to write 20 different languages. Many of them, or some of them, are Indo-European. They are not related to Semitic languages. They share with other Semitic languages the fact that the basic structure of the word is made of consonants, that vowels are not written always, so that the vowels can be added only when needed. And that certainly adds a layer of complexity, as I showed before, because you have a completely additional component that can be superimposed on the script. I think if you look, for example, at Hebrew, which is also a Semitic language, it's a very close language to Arabic. They are cousins. There are so many similar words, grammatic structure, and so on. Hebrew developed in a different way, where you have distinct blocks of letters. The language itself is very similar. The two languages are very similar, but the script evolved in different directions. I think it relates mostly to aesthetic and probably practical preferences more than reflecting the language as a language. Yes?
I'm glad you brought up the fact that there's regionality to the languages.
Are you asking different areas use different styles of Arabic, or?
Well, I was going to say, you end up making some particular typeface. Do you end up seeing this adopted in particular parts of the world, in particular groups, versus is it just more, hey, I have access to an Arabic face?
Yes. The question is, are some of these styles either reflective of regional preferences or end up being preferred by people in different areas? Yes, there are certain general characteristics of script for the major different areas that use the Arabic script. Arabic is, the script itself is used over a wide geographic area, and you can see the main regions as the Northwest Africa, Middle East, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India, and then Turkey above, which is very, very related to the Middle East. Now, each one of these 4 or 5 zones have clearly distinct preferences in terms of style. For example, in the East, they like nastaliq. In the Middle East, they like naskh. In the West, they like a Moroccan variety. And within those general regions, there are still local preferences as well. The overall appearance of the script is the same. It's only the proportions, the stress, the aesthetic preferences, but in some cases, the cursiveness, the amount of cursiveness makes writing quite complex. For example, nastaliq, which is preferred in Iran, from Iran to India, has a lot of variations of the letter forms that requires 10 or 15 different shapes of each letter that you would have one shape for in Latin in order to reproduce it correctly. I've designed, for example, a font specifically to meet the aesthetic needs of the Muslims in China. These are the Uyghur people. They are located in northwest China. Their typographic preferences are based on the Farsi or Persian tradition, but they still have their own unique twists because they are one of the few people who decided to incorporate all the vowels into their written language, so they no longer use additional vowel marks, but in terms of their writing, it is extremely simplified. For my eye, as a Middle Eastern Arab, it seemed a little too simplistic when I worked on it. But I forced myself to study their tradition and to reflect it, because it turns out that indeed they loved the font. They said this is the best Uyghur font they have ever seen. And I don't regret at all that I adhered to what the local people wanted to use. Yes.
Calligraphy has a very beautiful fluid movement to it, and there also seems to be a relationship with rigid geometric patterns and structures that balance it. Can you talk a bit about that relationship?
The question is, there are some of these works that have cursive fluidity, others that are quite structured, and sometimes the two are incorporated in some works. I've loved modern art since I was young, so I tended to search for calligraphic styles that appeal to my taste, especially when I was younger. And these turned out to be the very old Kufic and simple geometric styles. As I grew older, I learned more of the subtleties and the beauties of cursive styles, and came to appreciate that contemporary work can be based on these types of designs as well. But no matter what range of this spectrum I'm in, I'm always trying to benefit from my exposure and my knowledge of this rich history. So when you look at a tradition that took 1,500 years to evolve, during that time, there is really a great variety of works that inspires me, and I find myself always moving from one area to another rather than focusing on one particular point of balance. But I think no matter what style one works with, the basic concepts of good design will certainly apply. There is harmony, there is balance, there is rhythm, there is the visual expression of the message that is conveyed in the word. So all of these qualities are expressed in different ways based on the particular style that one works with. In my case, I also tend to evolve new designs when I find that the traditional examples are not adequate in a contemporary or a modern sense. Yes?
I was wondering about your process with John Hudson and how that normally goes. Do you start when he's doing the Latin versions that pair with your typefaces? Do you work closely together, or is it more of an individual process and then you?
When working with the Latin and Arabic?
Yes, with John Hudson.
Yes. John Hudson developed the Latin for Arabic typesetting, which is really a beautiful Latin. In this particular example, some work has been done for the Arabic and Latin by Paul Nelson and John Hudson before I was invited to redo the Arabic. So in this particular case, we did not have a close relationship because I was first asked to give some comments on the Arabic that has been already designed. So I started to give comments, and it turned out that the design was not really very good. They asked me to do a little more, but it turned out that it was best to redesign the Arabic. So I did, but at that point, the Latin was already set, and although I took it somewhat in consideration, it was not a very close cooperation. However, in one of my latest designs, one of my latest typefaces is called A1. I worked very closely with Juliet, who is a local type designer, to design the Latin. There, we went through the correct proportions. We adjusted things between the two scripts to the point where we felt they are completely compatible. I showed examples of Shelia. There, I worked with an existing typeface. So the Latin did not give any to work with the Arabic, but in A1, because the Latin was designed with the Arabic, I think we have achieved a more successful relationship. Do we have time still? One more question? Well, no more questions. Thank you. Oh, there is one here.
I was wondering if the three-dimensional figures, can people, are those, for me it's a mystery, but
the question is about three-dimensional square Kufic. Is this something that can be read by regular people, or is it just a puzzle to entertain the mind? Square Kufic, as a style, has a puzzle component in it from the start. It was developed to decorate the exteriors of buildings using architectural materials, but because of its geometric forms, it allowed the designer to fill spaces that are not commonly used for text. For example, a square. In text, we usually create bands of words, but in Square Kufi, you start to make many different shapes because the proportions and shapes of letter allow you to twist and turn any way you want, and still they fit together. Because of this, the compositions are sometimes more challenging. But once you know the concepts, the basic concepts, it's not as difficult as it seems, because in good design, the letters themselves and the words themselves still maintain their traditional forms and are still readable. So once you figure out the path by which you follow the text, you will be actually able to read it. However, over history, we have examples of poor examples of design where the designer had to twist things too much to fit, or chop things because they were too long, or these kinds of designs are more challenging and confusing. And it seems, unlike cursive calligraphy, where a calligrapher has to go through rigorous exercises to become a calligrapher, for Square Kufi, anybody thinks they can do it because it's just simple straight lines. However, the results are not always quite satisfactory, and that's the same in our time as well. I see a lot of examples where the proper rules are not followed, so it becomes difficult. However, no matter how clear it is, that mystery is part of the attraction and the special character of Square Kufic, and that's one of the reasons why I spend so much time to study it. Thank you again for coming. Thank you for hosting me.